Thanks for tuning in to The Tea, British Politics. Today we will be discussing Brexit, the British exit from the European Union. We'll be joined by multiple special guests from diverse backgrounds to provide a truly encompassing perspective on Brexit. First, Boris Johnson will explain what Brexit is and its political causes. Next, we will be joined by Professor James Seymour, who will explain the underlying structural causes of Brexit, including racism and globalization. Third, we will discuss Brexit's impact on small businesses with Olivia Wellington, who runs a craft store. Finally, we will discuss the overall long-term economic impacts with Donald Tusk, the former president of the European Council. Now, let me introduce you to Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister of the UK and one of the strongest advocates for a Leave vote.
So happy to join you on the show. Actually, I'm really not, because Brexit is still a very divisive issue, and we generally do not discuss it in the UK. Even years later, it is very difficult to separate the effects of COVID and the war in Ukraine with the effects of Brexit, so we still do not truly know exactly what the outcomes are.
Well, a lot of economists say otherwise, and that it is very clear that Brexit affected the British economy negatively. Nonetheless, we are happy to have you on the show. So, I know you said you hate to talk about it, but for our American listeners, what is Brexit?
Brexit is when the British people proudly said, "Hasta la vista, baby," to the entire continent of Europe by voting in a referendum to leave the European Union.
For the viewers, while the UK was in the EU provided them with the benefits of a common market. This meant that people, capital, and goods could move freely across the borders of the member states. Brexit was basically Britain leaving this common market. At its most integrated level, the EU is also an economic and monetary union with a shared currency and fiscal policies, but Britain was never a part of this. Could you explain the timeline of events that made up Brexit?
First, some context. We British have never really seen ourselves as part of continental Europe, and we even kept the British pound during the economic and monetary union. The 2008 financial crisis only reinforced the idea that Britain had to distance itself from other countries to be self-reliant. We saw that the interdependence of Britain on the United States and other EU countries like Greece has been detrimental, as their policy mistakes have affected us. Recognizing this, it all began in 2012, when my dear colleague, fellow Conservative and Prime Minister David Cameron said there was no reason to call a referendum on the UK's membership in the EU. Now, a referendum is when the public votes for a policy measure. Fast forward to 2013. Cameron promised to hold an in-out referendum on EU membership before 2017 if re-elected.
Why did he change his mind?
Well, he was in a fairly political sort of pickle, you see. He wanted to remain in power as the head of the Conservative Party, and he hoped to prevent Conservatives in Parliament from seeking out another leader. Additionally, he was worried about how the Conservative Party as a whole would perform in the next election. Truth be told, Cameron did not want to leave the EU. He only wanted to renegotiate the terms of the UK's membership to limit immigration and regain a bit of sovereignty. He predicted that the population would vote to remain inside the EU, and he thought that even if Britain did leave, they would be able to keep all their benefits. Long story short, Cameron won re-election, and on June 23rd, 2016, the entire country, or 72% of them, voted in the referendum. It was a close vote, but ultimately the Leavers won. 52% voted to leave the EU, and 48% voted to stay. To leave the EU, the UK invoked Article 50 under the Treaty of Lisbon on March 29, 2017. It was historic, as it was the first time a country had ever left the EU. That gave us 2 years to finish all the negotiations, including trading agreements and settlements for pre-pledged financial commitments. This was largely done under Theresa May, who became Prime Minister after Cameron resigned. Unfortunately for everyone in Britain, she was not a great negotiator. She called a snap election to strengthen her power, but that backfired. She lost her majority in Parliament, weakening her negotiating power. Under her, there were so many delays in the negotiations. This is where I come in and take over as Prime Minister. I fulfilled my promise to get Brexit done. A fantastic slogan, really. Did you see the video of me on the bulldozer? I ran it through a wall, and the bricks fell, and it said, "Get Brexit done," on the front. Yeah, I saw it. Nothing you cannot do without a good slogan.
It's catchy for sure. I have to ask, though, weren't you a little concerned that you were just using slogans instead of actually educating the public so that they can make an informed decision?
The public was well informed about the very good reasons to leave.
Like what? What were the central arguments for leaving?
Well, they include financial contributions, regulations, and immigration. The first problem surrounded British financial contributions to the EU. We provided them lots of funding, but we lacked control over how it was spent. It was an issue of sovereignty. We sent £350 million per week to the EU, but we felt we did not have a say in how it was used. That money would have been better used domestically to fund the National Health Service.
That number, 350 million. That number does not consider the British rebate. This may come as a shock to our listeners and everyone in the European Union, but when it was a member, Britain used to receive a rebate from the EU. This was basically a refund on their contributions to keep them in the international organization. Margaret Thatcher pushed for this in the 1980s. From the very beginning, the British felt like they were not benefiting enough from EU membership despite their contributions. So, with the money they got back through the rebate, British contributions to the EU only really amounted to 190 million euros.
Well, the red buses said 350 million, so that makes it right, probably. 350 million, 190 million, potato, tomato, same thing.
Additionally, economists found that Britain has had to pay around 190 million euros anyway just to access EU markets now. Doesn't it defeat the whole purpose of leaving if you have to spend that money anyway, and now you don't even get all the benefits?
Well, there were still other compelling reasons to leave. The regulations placed on British goods were simply insane. Brexit has allowed Britain to deregulate and create its own separate regulatory system to give producers more control over their goods.
But we've seen that in creating its own regulatory system, the UK has basically just duplicated most of the EU regulations while requiring companies to re-register. For example, chemical companies that once spent £500 million registering chemicals with the EU now have to do it again for £2 billion, according to the documentary The Brexit Effect. Isn't this just imposing more costs without benefits? Additionally, if Britain wants to trade with the EU, doesn't it have to comply with the regulations anyway?
Well, that's not important. Another reason for Brexit was immigration. The UK wanted to stop EU citizens from coming and taking all the jobs. You see, with the open borders under the EU, any EU citizen could come and go, and as a result, they took British jobs. Additionally, because of the common market, these jobs were leaving Britain, so we really wanted stronger control over our borders.
But haven't we seen recently that Britain is having trouble filling jobs in agriculture, construction, and tourism, and that cheap EU labor really contributed to the labor supply in those industries?
Well, another benefit is that British people will get a nice blue passport.
What does that have to do with anything?
Doesn't that mean that the underlying logic for Brexit was flawed? Isn't it true that the politicians weren't really honest about the causes, overstating both the problems with EU membership and how Brexit would fix them? It appears Boris Johnson has left the building. Oh, yes, he is ziplining away. Well, I think the most important takeaways from that segment are that the causes of Brexit were overblown, and the costs of leaving were not adequately weighed in comparison. This is what happens with political cueing, the use of catchy slogans to manipulate the opinion of the public, who is uneducated on a particular issue. I suppose now would be a great time to bring on our next guest to talk about a deeper, more structural approach to the causes of Brexit. Here we have James Seymour, a professor at Oxford University. Happy to have you.
Happy to be here. Genuinely, I mean that.
Well, that's nice for a change. So, tell me, what are the deeper underlying factors that drove Brexit?
Well, there are a few, but one of the most important has to do with immigration and race. Brexiteers told the public that Brexit could stop non-EU immigration. These immigrants primarily had darker skin. Really, this vote constitutes a reaction against the multicultural nature of Britain after decolonization. Professor Gurminder K. Bambra argued that Brexit is about the loss of empire because there were racist arguments that the country was threatened by immigrants, but only those with darker skin. She explained that there was this idea that Brexit would allow the Brexiteers to, quote, take the nation back, end quote. But Britain has never been a nation. Its imperial holdings as an empire and the Commonwealth always made it multicultural.
So, really, Brexit is a continuation of racism that has existed since the British Empire started?
Exactly. There is an incredible disparity between how paler migrants and darker migrants from former colonies were treated. Historically, these, quote, migrants from the colonies were not really migrants, but they actually held British citizenship through the British Nationality Act. Because these citizens were not moving to Britain, providing the citizenship was not perceived as a problem. However, once these citizens with darker skin started moving to Britain, many people had racist reactions to it. This ultimately resulted in the Commonwealth Immigration Acts that removed these individuals' rights to work in Britain. Brexit is a very similar racist way of saying who gets to belong in Britain, as we saw with pushes for control over immigration and borders. This really kind of leads us to the second underlying structural factor of Brexit, which was a fear of globalization. People's desire to control Britain's borders demonstrates an inward turn toward the nation and away from the world. As we know, globalization has diffused benefits and concentrated costs. The Leave voters did not feel the benefits of globalization they had received. Those who voted to leave were the greatest beneficiaries of trade with the EU, according to Alexander Betts. At the same time, they noticed the costs, which included reduced wages and increasing housing prices. Overall, too, this reaction against globalization can really be considered a reaction against the political establishment. Dissatisfied voters are upset with politics as usual. They feel as though no one is listening to them or representing them in the government.
You know, come to think of it, there are a lot of parallels that could be made with the United States. Many people are upset with status quo politics, resulting in the election of populist leaders like Donald Trump.
Right. Well, I think that is one of the main reasons why Brexit is important, not just to Britain, but to the world. It is part of a larger trend of disillusionment that leads to the rise of populist leaders.
Definitely. Trump's election was also very tied to anti-establishment rhetoric, and people were drawn to him because he was not a politician. We also saw very similar views on immigration and expressions of blatant racism, with threats to build a wall, pledges to stop immigration from Central America and Mexico, and even his executive order banning immigrants from Muslim-majority countries.
Right. And this turn away from globalization and toward nationalism is tied to populism and xenophobia. We have seen it around the world too, including Hungary with Viktor Orban and in France with Marine Le Pen. Really, Brexit is important for the politics of the world because it symbolizes the widespread dissatisfaction with the status quo politics that drives both the election of populist leaders and a turn away from the global community. As we've seen, populism can be a threat to democracy. At the same time, interacting with the global community is beneficial, especially through trade. Trade increases wealth, increases productivity, and reduces the likelihood of conflict. By retreating from the world, countries miss out on these benefits.
Wow, those are some big picture impacts. Thank you for joining us on the show today, James. Next up, we have Olivia Wellington, a small business owner from London. While our previous guests have mostly focused on the causes of Brexit, she'll be discussing its effects on her small business, a craft shop.
Happy to be here.
Let's get started. How has Brexit affected your business?
It's been horrible. Promises were unfulfilled, and the people were lied to, I tell you. Our businesses have just suffered because of Brexit.
How has it made things more difficult?
There is so much red tape with customs. It used to take me 3 days to get my goods in the arms of customers in Europe, but now the goods just sit in customs for at least 3 weeks, if not more, waiting to be checked. I just cannot ship anything efficiently. On top of that, to get my goods into continental Europe, I have to pay a tariff to access the market. When Britain was part of the EU, I never had to worry about this. The whole process is costly and time-consuming. As a result, I'm losing my customers. Companies in Holland and France used to buy my goods, but now they've dropped me and turned to continental-based suppliers. It is cheaper and more efficient to rely on them. Between the inefficiency at customs and the tariffs, Brexit imposed a lot of extra costs on my business, and unfortunately, I would have to pass this cost on to my customers. The customers just don't even want to deal with that.
So what's next then? How are you going to save your business?
I'm following the trend of relocating to continental Europe. A lot of small businesses have done this already to avoid the extra costs of the tariffs and the delays with the customs. There was a time when I had considered moving to Northern Ireland, though, because it has full access to the EU markets.
This brings up a great point about how Brexit has impacted Northern Ireland, which shares an island with the Republic of Ireland. The Northern Ireland Protocol has allowed Northern Ireland to remain in the EU common market, so it has a great position to trade with the EU. I have to ask, though, when you were considering this, were you a little concerned about the Troubles resurging? For my American audience, the Troubles were a period of violence from 1972 through 1999 in Northern Ireland in which terrorist groups, including the Irish Republican Army, wanted to free themselves from British rule. The border was a site of conflict during this period. The Good Friday Agreement, which was the peace treaty, basically did away with the hard border. Because both the UK and Ireland were EU members, people could freely cross the border. Imposing a new border post-Brexit would have been incredibly divisive and split communities in half. Officials were worried this could increase hostilities, and this is why there is now a sea border between Britain and Northern Ireland, rather than between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Now, the goods entering Northern Ireland from Britain have to be checked to make sure they meet all the EU regulations. So, back to the question. Were you worried about violence in Northern Ireland?
We have not seen a flare-up of any hostilities, so not really.
One last question for you. If you had to sum up your experience with Brexit in a few words, what would they be?
We were lied to. We were all told that British goods would still be wanted because they were just that good. We really thought the EU would cut us a good deal where trade would still be easy, but we would not have to pay the cost of membership. Apparently, we have seen that the EU is an all-or-nothing sort of deal, and we were wrong to believe our leaders when they said otherwise.
Well, let's leave our listeners with that thought. Thank you for your time, Olivia. Last but certainly not least, we are very happy to welcome Donald Tusk to the show. As the former president of the European Council during the majority of Brexit negotiations, He was heavily involved in the process. Happy to be here. So, what exactly were the EU's approaches to Brexit, and which was the ultimate outcome? The two pathways for a Brexit were a soft Brexit and a hard Brexit. In the case of a soft Brexit, Britain would have remained in the common market, which would have allowed for the free movement of goods, people, and capital. Neither people nor goods would have to travel through customs. However, this was not what happened, and ultimately the result of the negotiations was a hard Brexit. The UK left the common market and now trades under the World Trade Organization rules, which makes it harder for Britain to trade with continental Europe. It might seem like we are being mean for that, but we aren't. To stop other countries from leaving, it's in our best interest to make Britain's departure a bit painful economically. Speaking of economics, what are the economic impacts of leaving on Britain? It has not been pretty. In the short term, immediately after Brexit passed, the pound tanked, losing value compared to the dollar. This weakening of the pound meant more money was needed to buy the same foreign goods. This translated into higher costs for British imports. While this weakening of the currency can make goods cheaper to export and increase their demand among foreign buyers, this really did not happen. The combination of more expensive imports and a lack of greater exports resulted in inflation. Speaking of exports and imports, how has Brexit affected Britain's trade? Well, compared to other advanced economies, Britain's trade intensity is lower. This means it is trading less with other countries, considering the size of the economy. Additionally, small businesses in the UK have a lower number of trade relationships when compared to similar businesses in the EU. In total, according to the London School of Economics measurement provided in that fantastic documentary, The Brexit Effect, the number of trade relationships between the EU and UK decreased by 1/3 after the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That's to say, Brexit really harmed British trade. Moving to another economic indicator, how has Brexit impacted investment? Well, there really is not any investment. The government has tried to incentivize it through super deductions, which would decrease taxes in exchange for companies investing, but this has not worked. Brexit resulted in a lot of uncertainty surrounding the British economy. People do not want to invest when there is uncertainty because they do not want to risk losing their money. This is particularly worrisome because investment causes economic growth, and in 2023, there was no change in the British GDP, and GDPs were growing in other advanced economies. So, if you had to explain in a big picture way the economic costs of Brexit, how would you do that? I think the best analogy is that it is a slow puncture, because the most damaging effects will occur over time, affecting income and the economy. Due to all the red tape, customs work, and tariffs, businesses in Britain will become less productive. This lower production means that the GDP would be smaller and the wages lower than if the UK had remained in the European Union. It will also harm education. It will hurt cooperative research efforts between the UK and EU universities, while also making study abroad more difficult for both British students going to the EU and EU students going to the UK. All in all, Brexit will negatively impact the economy for years to come. So that's really what a hard Brexit looks like. It is indeed. Thank you for your time, Mr. Tusk. That's a lot of information. So let's recap why exactly Brexit is important with some of the key takeaways from each guest. From our interview with Boris Johnson, we learned that Brexit was driven by political cues. Mr. Johnson outlined that 3 surface-level political reasons for Brexit were control over financial contributions to the EU, bureaucratic EU regulations, and a desire to control EU-based immigration. However, none of these reasons really made sense when considered overall or in comparison to the consequences of Brexit. This is a prime example of how political cueing, the use of simple slogans, basically resulted in votes for Brexit without full awareness of the consequences. Given that Brexit will affect the UK for generations, this is a lesson about how economic policy should not be driven by catchy slogans, but an educated public aware of the consequences. Second, from our interview with James Seymour, the professor, we saw that on a deeper, structural level, Brexit was driven by fears of immigration tied to race and a backlash to globalization. In particular, the latter means Brexit is important because it is part of a wider trend of disillusionment with the globalized world and the political status quo. The same sort of populist nationalist movements are gaining power across developed democracies. Third, we saw the effects of Brexit on business owner Olivia Wellington and the many other small business owners in similar situations. In this sense, Brexit was important because it harmed small businesses by making customs more time-intensive and imposing extra costs through tariffs. This harms these businesses' trading relationships and their ability to sell their product. Many of these businesses are losing their customers in Europe. To save their businesses, some relocate to continental Europe. In this same interview, we also discussed how Brexit had the potential to reincite the period of political violence known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, but luckily we have not seen this. Finally, we interviewed former European Council President Donald Tusk, who explained the adverse effects of a hard Brexit on Britain's economy, trade, and investment. Describing it as a slow puncture, Tusk indicated that Brexit's importance stems from its long-term impacts on the British economy, including a lower GDP and per capita income compared to if Britain had remained in the EU. So, overall, Brexit had both wide-ranging causes and effects. Its overall importance stems from how the British chose to turn away from the world community to pursue sovereignty, at the cost of economic self-harm. Both the negative short-term and long-term impacts indicate the great extent of interdependence within the world and the harm that comes with divorce from the world community. All in all, Brexit was a decision driven by catchy slogans that will impact Britain's economy for generations.